Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How we doing? Spectre here. Time for a little fireside chat. A little bit chilly in these parts where I'm at. Down in the teens, I believe, for the evening. So a little chilly in the central part of the country here. So good night to have a little fire. Gather around. And of course, grab your beverage of choice, as always. We'll get into a couple pieces here that I've got selected for the evening. Some of the thinking pieces that I usually save for these types of settings. So appreciate you guys tuning in here this evening. And we'll get after it here in just a moment. Let a few more people cycle in here. Got a couple of you on the YouTube side. Twitch, D-Live, looks like we're up across the board on Tiger Network as well. So good to have you guys all aboard here this evening. Alright. Let's see here. There we go. Get that set up. There we go. Alright, so the first piece I'm going to cover here tonight kind of goes along with a piece in that I have covered in the past, talking about fourth turnings in that, where we kind of find ourselves in history here. Been a number of pieces over the years talking about said fourth turning and whatnot, so this is kind of a continuation of that. So tonight we're going to cover a piece called The Fourth Turning Detonation. It's out of the Burning Platform blog. Jim Quinn does that. And as I read this is part one. There is another part that just came through this evening. I'll probably save that for a subsequent fireside chat some other evening, so multiple part series. In any case, Americans today fear that linearism, alias the American dream, has run its course. Many would welcome some enlightenment about history's patterns and rhythms, but today's intellectual elites offer little that's useful. Caught between the entropy of the chaoticists and the hubris of the linearists, the American people have lost their moorings, and that by Strauss and Howe of The Fourth Turning. The ancients believed that each cyclical extreme, mirroring the hopes and fears of the other, helps generate the other. The night longs for the day for night. In war, people yearn for relief from strife, leading to peace. In peace, people yearn to champion what they love, leading to war. And that also out of Strauss and Howe's The Fourth Turning. When I started thinking about my annual beginning of the year article in early January, I tried to formulate a catchy title, knowing we have entered the 13th year of this fourth turning, with the intensity of the crisis reaching an unparalleled level since November 4th. I decided upon fourth turning detonation. I immediately thought that might be too dire and figured I would change it later. After the first few weeks of the new year, I now think it might be grossly inadequate to describe what is coming in 2021. It is easy to get distracted by the daily gyrations, ceaseless media propaganda, political theater, false narratives, and delusional beliefs of both the left and right, as this military empire built on debt and deceit spirals toward its fiery, cataclysmic climax. Opposing forces have gathered themselves into position, focusing on defeating their domestic enemies, with the left seeming to have strategic advantage, but led by hubristic dullards, while numerous foreign adversaries circle like hungry vultures, ready to pounce on the dying beast of an empire. Last January, I wrote a two-part article called 2020, Year of Living Dangerously, which harkened back to another article I had written 8 years before, 2012, Year of Living Dangerously. I lamented the fact I had not understood fourth turnings will take their own sweet time on the way to climax, with twists and turns which will differentiate it from previous crisis periods in U.S. history. My impatience for the great battle to resolve this struggle has not and will not impact the timeline, but the three elements driving this crisis remain firmly in control, as they have since 2008: debt, civic decay, and global disorder. My belief regarding the subtext of what has happened and is happening in this country has not changed. I certainly underestimated the lengths these psychopaths in suits would go in 2020 to further pillage the world's wealth while using a pandemic as cover to further their agenda of hegemony and turning the world into a virtual prison camp under constant technological surveillance. Despite the timing, I still believe that which is unsustainable will not be sustained. And there's a picture of the cycle, and it kind of shows that we are on the upside of that, at least looking at it from a Federal Reserve balance sheet standpoint. Another quote here says, "It seems I always underestimate the ability of sociopathic central bankers and their willingness to destroy the lives of hundreds of millions to benefit their oligarch masters. I always underestimate the rampant corruption that permeates Washington, D.C., and the executive suites in mega corporations across the land. And I always overestimate the intelligence, civic-mindedness, and ability to understand math of the ignorant masses that pass for citizens in this country. It seems that issuing trillions of new debt to pay off trillions of bad debt, government-sanctioned accounting fraud, mainstream media propaganda, government data manipulation, and a populace blinded by mass delusion can stave off the inevitable consequences of an unsustainable economic system." I used to try and make specific predictions about the new year, generally centered upon economic chaos, stock markets crashing, global conflict, and various other doom-like events. But those running this clown show somehow convince the masses all is well. The economy is healthy. Inflation is non-existent. Debt does not matter. College makes you smart. We're energy self-sufficient. 100 million working-age Americans not working, but unemployment was 3.5%. The stock market hitting all-time highs is good for you, even though your real wages haven't gone up in a decade, and America was great again. It is amazing to me how effective propaganda is when multiple generations have been indoctrinated and socially engineered in the government, school system, and decades of boob-tube fake news has been programmed into their pliably ignorant brains. Edward Bernays created the game plan, and the techno-oligarch despots currently running the show are executing it to perfection. And it highlights a piece from The Invisible Government. Can't tell what year that is from in the graphic here that it shows, but it looks like it's probably from maybe about the 30s or 40s. Probably around the time that Bernays championed and come up with propaganda. Says the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed. Our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. And that's Edward Bernays and propaganda. This fourth turning likely has another 5 to 10 years before some sort of convulsive resolution, unless it is accelerated like the Civil War fourth turning, with similar tragic consequences and mass casualties. Predicting the actual events will occur over a short-term time frame is a fool's errand, so I prefer to try and discern the direction and amplitude of the ongoing crisis to gauge how we should prepare for what is coming. I do admire writers like Jim Kunstler who really go out on a limb and make extremely specific forecasts for the coming year, like he did on January 1st with his Forecast 2021, Chinese fire drills on the side of French fries, Jacobin style, and Russian dressing. If even 25% of his predictions had come to fruition, 2021 would have gone down as one of the most earth-shattering in history. But here we are, a few weeks later, and all his predictions about Trump going to war with the deep state and winning a glorious victory for the American people failed to materialize. Trump is golfing at Mar-a-Lago, while the deep state remains firmly in control and in the midst of consolidating their power by crushing dissent through domestic terrorism legislation and complete control of social media platforms. And of course, it highlights yet another article, looks to be out of Gateway Pundit. Democrats are drafting legislation to criminalize Trump rallies, classify them as quote-unquote domestic terrorism. And that was clear back on January 11th. So here we are, marching right along. Even Kunstler acknowledges the fourth turning as a generational dynamic driving the events pushing the country and the world towards armed conflict. My high-level prognostications for 2020 certainly did not include a global pandemic used to introduce an Orwellian global dystopia and justification to steal a presidential election through mail-in ballot fraud and voting machine rigging. Of course, Bill Gates predicted the pandemic in 2018, and his buddy Fauci in 2017 said there was no doubt Donald J. Trump would be confronted with a surprise infectious disease outbreak during his presidency. I wonder why he had no doubt. Fauci, an unknown lifetime government bureaucrat, is now a media darling, despite being wrong about everything, and Gates' wealth has soared during this pandemic. My big picture guesses last year were colored by the assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani on January 3rd, expecting Middle East conflict to erupt. These were my main conjectures for 2020. The Fed will continue to run their electronic printing presses at warp speed until the inevitable banquet of consequences is served to all. We have entered the extreme greed phase of this debt-based Ponzi scheme. The stock market is in the blow-off stage, where earnings, valuations, and rational thinking are meaningless. Momentum and a delusional belief in the infallibility of the Fed are all that matter. Who knows how far it will go, but fear will eventually rear its ugly head, and a cascading collapse will make a lot of useful investing idiots very angry for the third time in the last 2 decades. The Democrats and their surveillance state co-conspirators have determined the best way to cover up their treasonous acts are to stay on the offensive by impeaching Trump on bogus charges. The social distress I noted last year continues unabated today, as the glorification of abnormality reaches new heights. The flames of division and disarray are fanned unceasingly by the left-wing media to distract from the true, desperate financial situation of the country. Israel quietly foments discontent and turmoil across the region to keep the focus off itself. Russia and China support Iran economically and militarily to offset Americans' dominance of the region. Confusion reigns. Anyone with an ounce of critical thinking skills knows none of this is about freedom, democracy, or doing the right thing. It's about oil, and it's about the military-industrial complex requiring enemies to keep the profits flowing. The shale miracle is just another delusion built upon easy money pumped out by the Fed. No one can make profits on shale oil at $60 per barrel. The months leading up to the election will be a circus. Propaganda, misinformation, and outright lies will be spread like manure. Of course, voting will not alleviate the issues which will continue to drive this fourth turning toward its climax: debt, civic decay, global disorder. No matter the result of the upcoming election, neither side will accept the outcome. There are no viable political solutions to our current dilemmas. It is just a matter of when and where the conflict goes hot and blood is spilled. I do not know what events will dominate the coming year, but I do know the intensity of hate and vitriol will increase. I do know military conflict in the Middle East will expand. I do know the political machinations in this country will surge as the election approaches. I do know the deep state will do everything in their immense power to undermine Trump. I do know the Fed will QE and Trump will cheer every new stock market record. I do know I will be lied to and propagandized by the mainstream corporate media. So those were some of his predictions from last year. Says, I knew 2020 had the potential to be a chaotic year, but didn't anticipate a flu with a 99.7% survival rate being used by totalitarianism-minded politicians to destroy the global economy. Usher in Orwellian police state lockdown measures across the globe, a stock market crash, followed by Fed-created bubbles still growing ever bubblier through $4 trillion of money printing, adding $4 trillion to the national debt, with another $3 trillion on the way in 2021, paying millions to sit at home eating Cheetos and watching Netflix, destroying a few 100,000 small businesses while enriching mega corporations, putting a nail in a coffin of the First Amendment through censorship of conservative speech, and blatantly stealing a presidential election. The globalist elite want to keep the fear of a high level to institute their global reset, where you will own nothing and be happy, or you will be brought to heel by the truncheon. This was the year it became crystal clear. The world is filled with good people, governed and manipulated by bad people. By delaying this article until after January 20th, I allowed the QAnon psyop of Trump using the military to rescue the country to pass into history as another delusion of hope over reason. I truly do not know whether the QAnon phenomena, that was not widely known by Trump supporters or most people, was just a LARP being played by former Dungeons & Dragons keyboard warriors, or an FBI/CIA counterintelligence operation designed to keep a segment of the population distracted and ever hopeful their white knight would rescue them from the clutches of the evil deep state. I am reminded of the quote about hope from President Snow in the Hunger Games. Hope. It is the only thing stronger than fear. A little hope is effective. A lot of hope is dangerous. A spark is fine as long as it's contained. The elevation of Trump to president and the spark of hope he would truly drain the swamp, arrest the traitorous deep state coup co-conspirators, lead his legions to victory over the forces of evil, and make America great again, kept half the people in the country hopeful for the last 4 years. Meanwhile, the military-industrial complex raked in hundreds of billions more from the American taxpayer. Wall Street bankers gorged on the trillions of free money, manufactured by their captured puppets at the Federal Reserve. The Silicon Valley despots consolidated their hold on commerce and communication, and the average American saw their standard of living continue its 50-year decline. The question is whether those constituting the invisible government allowed too much hope and needed the engineered pandemic to reintroduce fear as their primary control technique moving forward. They believe they have contained the spark with their fraudulent election victory, installation of an empty, senile vassal as their conduit for the Great Reset, having their media mouthpieces propagate the falsity of a right-wing white supremacist insurrection at the Capitol, crushing dissent by censoring the truth through totalitarian social media conglomerates, proceeding with an impeachment farce based on Trump telling his supporters to peacefully protest the fraudulent election outcome, and threatening to destroy the lives of all vocal Trump supporters. I am highly doubtful they have contained the spark. I believe there are smoldering embers just waiting to be stirred into a conflagration, which will engulf the entire world in a fiery purging of the existing social order, which has exhausted itself and needs to be cleansed. Jefferson understood the nature of fourth turnings 200 years before Strauss and Howe put it to paper. Of course, another graphic highlighting the old tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of tyrants. A quote here says, "Try to unlearn the obsessive fear of death and the anxious quest for a death avoidance that pervades linear thinking in nearly every modern society. The ancients knew that, without periodic decay and death, nature cannot complete its full round of biological and social change. Without plant death, weeds would strangle the forest. Without human death, memories would never die, and unbroken habits and customs would strangle civilization. Social institutions require no less. Just as floods replenish soil and fires rejuvenate forests, a fourth turning clears out society's exhausted elements and creates an opportunity." Again, another quote from Strauss and Howe from the Fourth Turning. In part 2 of this article, I will examine the concept of the Gray Champion, the role in fourth turnings, and make some speculation as to the course of 2021 and the remainder of this fourth turning. So, that is the first piece. Again, as I stated here at the top of the broadcast. The second piece did come out tonight, but I'll save that for a later fireside. We'll walk through these piece by piece. But again, it's one of those deals where over the last 6-8 years of following this, many articles about these fourth turnings and where we stand in history and cycles and everything that we go through. So it's interesting to see it play out. We'll see if the slightly prophetic side of these things actually do come to pass, how they come to pass, and that sort of thing. So stay tuned. All right, good to see you, J-Boy and Diamond Deuce in house here this evening, joining. Good to have you. All right, so also continuing on that theme for the evening, got another interesting article called "That's All, Folks," as if it's the end of the old Looney Tunes show. This by consentfactory.org. Well, there we go. It says, as they used to say at the end of all those wacky Looney Tunes cartoons, that's all, folks. The show is over. Literal Russian asset Hitler, the latest, greatest threat to Western democracy, the monster of Mar-a-Lago, Trumpzilla, Trumpenstein, the Ayatollah of Orange Shinola, has finally been humiliated and given the bum rush out of Washington by the heroic forces of the global cap resistance, with a little help from the U.S. military. The whole thing went exactly to script. Well, okay. Not exactly to script. Despite 4 years of dire warnings by the corporate media, the intelligence community, Hollywood celebrities, the Democratic Party, faux anti-fascists, fake left pundits, and pretty much every utterly deluded, Trump-obsessed liberal with an internet connection, there was no Hitlerian Reichstag fire, no Boogaloo, no Civil War II, no coup, no white supremacist uprising. Nothing. The man simply got on a chopper and was flown away to his Florida resort. I know, you're probably thinking, wow, how embarrassing for the global cap resistance, being exposed as a bunch of utterly shameless neo-Goebbelian propagandists and liars, and hysterical idiots and such. And in any other version of reality, you'd have a point, but not in this one. No, in this reality, democracy has prevailed. Yes, it was touch and go there for a while, as there was no guarantee that the intelligence community, the military-industrial complex, Western governments, the corporate media, supranational corporations, internet oligarchs, and virtually every other component of the global capitalist empire could keep one former game show host with no real political power whatsoever from taking over the entire world. Still, Trump's failure to go full Hitler, or even half Hitler, was somewhat awkward. I mean, you can't whip millions of people into a 4-year frenzy of fear and hatred of a clearly powerless ass-clown president and portray him as a Russian intelligence asset and the son of Hitler and all the rest of it, and then just drop the act cold and laugh in their faces. That would leave them feeling like total morons who had just spent the last 4 years of their lives being lied to and emotionally manipulated, or like members of a cult or something. Fortunately, for Global Cap, this was not a major problem. All they had to do was produce a cheap simulation of Trump going full Hitler. It didn't even have to be convincing. They just needed a semi-dramatic event to plug into the official narrative, something they could call an attempted coup, an insurrection, an attack, and so on, and which millions of credulous liberals could hysterically shriek about on the internet. The storming of the Capitol did the trick. They held a dress rehearsal in Berlin last August, and then gave the real performance in the Capitol building. This time it was for all the money, so they went ahead and got a couple of people killed. It wasn't very hard to pull off. All they actually had to do, in both Berlin and D.C., was allow a small fringe group of angry protesters to gain access to the building, film it, and then pump out the attempted coup narrative. It made no difference whatsoever that the domestic terrorists, in both Berlin and Washington, or a completely unorganized, unarmed mob that posed absolutely zero threat of staging a coup and overthrowing the government. It also made not the slightest difference that Trump didn't actually quote-unquote incite the mob. Yes, I put myself through the agony of reading every word of his speech, which was the usual word salad from start to finish. We're talking propaganda here, not reality. This so-called violent storming of the Capitol, quote-unquote, set the stage for the main event, which was the show of force we have all witnessed. Someone, I'm not entirely clear who, ordered in the troops, tens of thousands of them, locked down Washington, erected fences, set up roadblocks and military checkpoints, and otherwise occupied the government district. It looked like any other U.S. military post-regime change occupation, because that's what it was, which was precisely the point. As I have been repeating for over 4 years now, it was always going to end this way, with Global Cap making an example of Trump and reminding everyone who is really in charge. Look, let's be clear about these last 4 years, because there are all kinds of crazy theories going around, not to mention the official Global Cap narrative, but what actually happened is pretty simple. Here's the whole story, as concise as I can make it. Back in 2016, the American people, sick to the gills of global capitalism and its increasingly oppressive woke ideology, elected an unauthorized, narcissistic ass clown to the highest office in the land. They did this for a variety of reasons, but mostly it was just a big F.U. to the establishment. It was an act of rebellion against a government which they know is owned by unaccountable, supranational corporations and oligarchs who openly detest them. It was an act of rebellion against a system of government they know they have no influence over, and are not going to have any influence over. It was an act of rebellion against global capitalism, the unopposed global hegemonic system, which has dominated the world for the last 30 years, whether they realized what they were rebelling against or not. This act of rebellion happened on the heels of Brexit, another such act of rebellion, and in the context of the rise of assorted populist movements all throughout the world. When Trump actually won in 2016, the global capitalist ruling classes realized they had a serious problem, a populist rebellion in the heart of the empire. So they suspended the global war on terror and launched the war on populism. The ultimate objective of the war on populism was to neutralize this quote-unquote populist rebellion and remind the public who is actually running things. Think of the Trump era as a prison riot. In any maximum security prison, the prisoners know they can't escape, but they can definitely raise a little hell now and then, which they tend to do when they get really tired of being abused and neglected by the prison guards. Most prison riots run out of steam on their own, but if they go on too long or get too ugly, the penal authorities typically respond by shooting a few prisoners, usually the ringleaders, and reminding the inmates that they are in a prison and that the owners of the prison have guns, whereas they have shivs made out of spoons and toothbrushes. This, basically, is what we've just experienced. The global capitalist ruling classes have just reminded us who is really in charge, who the U.S. military answers to, and how quickly they can strip away the facade of democracy and the rule of law. They have reminded us of this for the last 10 months by putting us under house arrest, beating and arresting us for not following orders, for not wearing masks, for faking walks without permission, for having the audacity to protest their decrees, for challenging their official propaganda about the virus, the election results, etc. They are reminding us currently by censoring dissent and deplatforming anyone they deem a threat to their official narratives and ideology. In other words, Global Cap is teaching us a lesson. I don't know how much clearer they could make it. They just installed a new puppet president who can't even simulate mental acuity in a lockdown, military-guarded ceremony which no one was allowed to attend, except for a few members of the ruling classes. They got some epigon of Albert Speer to convert the mall, where the public normally gathers, into a field of flags, symbolizing quote-unquote unity. They even did the Nazi Leuchtturm thing. To hammer the point home, they got Lady Gaga to dress up as a Hunger Games character, with a mockingjay brooch, and sing the national anthem. They broadcast a spectacle to the entire world. And the lesson isn't quite over yet. It won't be over for a while. The war on populism will simply morph into the new normal war on domestic terror, which will become one more theater in the global war on terror, which has been on hiatus and which will now resume. As I have pointed out repeatedly over the past 4 years, we appear to be headed toward a dystopian future in which there will essentially be two classes of people. A, the normals, in effect those who conform to global capitalist ideology and decrees, and B, the extremists, those who don't. It will make no difference whatsoever what type of quote-unquote extremists these extremists are. Religious fundamentalist extremists, Islamic extremists, Christian extremists, right-wing extremists, left-wing extremists, white supremacist or black nationalist extremists, virus deniers, anti-vaxxers, conspiracy theorists, anti-maskers, recalcitrant transphobians, anti-transhumanists, pronoun resistors, defiant oppositionalists, or whatever. The names don't really matter. The point is, conform, or be labeled an extremist, a domestic terrorist, or some other type of antisocial person, or social deviant, or potential threat to public health. I don't claim to know every detail, but one thing seems abundantly clear. We are not going back to the way things were. GlobalCap has been explaining this to us over and over for almost a year. They couldn't have made it any more explicit. When they warned us to get ready because a new normal was coming, they meant it. And now, well, here it is. And that's a piece by C.J. Hopkins over at the Consent Factory. So nonetheless, yes, this is the dystopian future we have to look forward unless we fight back, right? Can't sit idly by. So along those lines, Ron Paul had this to say in recent days. Out of the Ron Paul Institute, he penned an article that says, when fascism comes, it will be wearing a mask. Or 2, or maybe 4. I don't know. I added that last little bit just because of what has come out in recent days and the ridiculousness of it all. In any case, almost immediately after his inauguration, President Joe Biden began creating new government diktats via executive orders. Many of these executive orders concern coronavirus, fulfilling Biden's promise to make ramping up a coronavirus-inspired attack on liberty a focus of his first 100 days. One of Biden's executive orders imposes mask and social distancing mandates on anyone in a federal building or on federal land. The mandates also apply to federal employees when they are, quote, on duty anywhere. Members of the military are included in the definition of federal employees. Will citizens of Afghanistan, Iraq, and other countries where U.S. troops are or will be spreading democracy be happy to learn the troops shooting up their towns are wearing masks and practicing social distancing? Interesting question. Another one of Biden's executive orders forces passengers on airplanes, trains, and other public transportation to wear masks. Biden's mask mandates contradict his pledge to follow the science. Studies have not established that masks are effective at preventing the spread of coronavirus. Regularly wearing a mask, though, can cause health problems. Biden's mask mandates are also an unconstitutional power grab. Some say these mandates are an exercise of the federal government's constitutional authority to regulate interstate commerce. However, the Constitution gives Congress, not the President, the power to regulate interstate commerce. The President does not have the authority to issue executive orders regulating interstate commerce absent authorization by a valid law passed by Congress. The founders gave Congress sole lawmaking authority, and they would be horrified by the modern practice of presidents creating law with a stroke of the pen. Just as important, the Commerce Clause was not intended to give the federal government vast regulatory power. Far from giving the U.S. government powers such as the power to require people to wear masks, the Commerce Clause was simply intended to ensure Congress could protect free trade among the states. Biden also signed an executive order supporting using the Defense Production Act to increase the supply of vaccines, testing supplies, and other items deemed essential to respond to coronavirus. The Defense Production Act is a Cold War relic that gives the president what can fairly be called dictatorial authority to order private businesses to alter their production plans and violate existing contracts with private customers in order to produce goods for the government. Mask and social distancing mandates, government control of private industry, and some of Biden's other executive actions, such as one creating a new public health jobs corps with responsibilities including performing contact tracing and American citizens, are the types of actions one would expect from a fascist government, not a constitutional republic. Joe Biden, who is heralded by many of his supporters as saving democracy from fascist Trump, could not even wait one day before beginning to implement fascistic measures that are completely unnecessary to protect public health. Biden will no doubt use other manufactured crises, including climate change and domestic terrorism, to expand government power and further restrict our liberty. Under Biden, fascism will not just carry an American flag, it will also wear a mask. And that, like I said, is a piece penned by old Ron Paul. Glad to see he is back to health after his bout last year. But he's absolutely right. Them trying to think that they can institute law by executive decree, just like our mayors, governors, and everybody else did throughout 2020, thinking that they can slide stuff in under the radar and people just abide in it. No, that's not how law works. Under a constitutional republic, we have legislators to create the law. The executive is to faithfully execute the law. But because of the ignorance of the populace and our lack of understanding of civics and how government works, we run into this problem, don't we? So again, this is an area where we need to smarten up and educate folks and say, no, enough is enough. And again, that little thing called consent, right? Because if we do not go back and say we do not consent, then it is implied that we do, and thus we get run over. So in any case, carrying along, got another interesting piece here out of the Rutherford Institute by John Whitehead. It says, enemies of the deep state, the government's war on domestic terrorism is a trap. Well, of course it is. We kind of know that. We know that the framework has already been set. The business that happened on January 6th they're going to use to its fullest effect and get out of it what they need to. Perhaps even going so far as to implement a Patriot Act 2.0, which I'm sure is already written up and just waiting to be introduced on the House of Representatives floor. You know, because corporations and the folks on K Street probably already have this already buttoned up for us at the ready. Or, as Nancy Pelosi would like to say, we got to pass the bill to find out what's in it. So in any case, this is where we come in. It says, this is an issue that all Democrats, Republicans, Independents, Libertarians should be extremely concerned about, especially because we don't have to guess about where this goes or how this ends. What characteristics are we looking for as we are building this profile of a potential extremist? What are we talking about? Religious extremists? Are we talking about Christians, evangelical Christians? What is a religious extremist? Is it somebody who is pro-life? The proposed legislation could create a very dangerous undermining of your civil liberties, our freedoms in our Constitution, and a targeting of almost half of the country. This is a quote by Tulsi Gabbard recently, former congresswoman, I should say. So, even though she's not in Congress, despite how you feel about her history, CFR or not, obviously she kind of comes across as potentially a little bit more left-leaning Ron Paul. This is how it begins. We are moving fast down that slippery slope to an authoritarian society in which the only opinions, ideas, and speech expressed are the ones permitted by the government and its corporate cohorts. In the wake of the January 6th riots at the Capitol, domestic terrorism, quote-unquote, has become the new poster child for expanding the government's powers at the expense of civil liberties. Of course, domestic terrorist is just the latest bullseye phrase to be used interchangeably with anti-government, extremist, and terrorist to describe anyone who might fall somewhere on a very broad spectrum of viewpoints that could be considered, quote-unquote, dangerous. Watch and see. We're all about to become enemies of the state. And I guess I'll pause there real quick, because I don't believe he touches upon this. Maybe he does, I don't recall. But if you recall, after 9/11, I don't remember if it was in the Patriot Act or if it was in the NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, that in effect, everybody within the confines of these United States is considered an enemy combatant. We are at war here on this soil. And of course that was done by executive orders and things of that nature, all of which keep the ship running so that the Federal Reserve can continue to print money to infinity. Right? Plenty of EOs to keep that charade going. Article continues. Says in a deja vu mirroring of the legislative fallout from 9/11 and the ensuing buildup of the security state, there is a growing demand in certain sectors for the government to be given expanded powers to root out quote-unquote domestic terrorism. The Constitution be damned. If this is a test of Joe Biden's worthiness to head up the American police state, he seems ready. As part of his inaugural address, President Biden pledged to confront and defeat a rise of political extremism, white supremacy, domestic terrorism. Biden has also asked the Director of National Intelligence to work with the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security in carrying out a, quote, comprehensive threat assessment, end quote, of domestic terrorism. And then, to keep the parallels going, there is the proposed Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act of 2021, introduced after the January 6th riots. Ta-da, here we are, which aims to equip the government with the tools to identify, monitor, and thwart those who could become radicalized to violence. Don't blink, or you'll miss the sleight of hand. This is the tricky part of the deep state's con game that keeps you focused on the shell game in front of you, while your wallet is being picked clean by ruffians in your midst. It follows the same pattern as every other convenient crisis used by the government as an excuse to expand its powers at the citizenry's expense, and at the expense of our freedoms. As investigative journalist Glenn Greenwald warns, the last 2 weeks have ushered in a wave of new domestic police powers and rhetoric in the name of fighting quote-unquote terrorism that are carbon copies of many of the worst excesses on the first war on terror that began nearly 20 years ago. This new war on terror, one that is domestic in name from the start and carries the explicit purpose of fighting extremists and domestic terrorists among American citizens on U.S. soil, presents the whole slew of historically familiar dangers when governments, exploiting media-generated fear and dangers, arm themselves with the power to control information, debate, opinion, activism, and protests. Greenwald is referring to the USA Patriot Act passed almost 20 years ago, which paved the way for the eradication of every vital safeguard against government overreach, corruption, and abuse. Free speech, the right to protest, the right to challenge government wrongdoing, due process, a presumption of innocence, the right to self-defense, accountability and transparency in government, privacy, press, sovereignty, assembly, bodily integrity, representative government, all of these and more have become casualties in the government's war on the American people, a war that has grown more pronounced since September 11, 2001. Some members of Congress get it. In a letter opposing expansion of national security powers, a handful of congressional representatives urged their colleagues not to repeat the mistakes of the past. Says while many may find comfort in increased national security powers in the wake of this attack, we must emphasize that we have been here before and we have seen where that road leads. Our history is littered with examples of initiatives sold as being necessary to fight extremism that quickly devolve into tools used for the mass violation of the human civil rights of the American people. To expand the government's national security powers once again at the expense of the human and civil rights of the American people would only serve to further undermine our democracy, not protect it. Cue the emergency state, the government's Machiavellian version of crisis management that justifies all manner of government tyranny in the so-called name of national security. This is the power grab hiding in plain sight, obscured by the political machinations of the self-righteous elite. This is how the government continues to exploit crises and use them as opportunities for power grabs under the guise of national security. Indeed, this is exactly how the government added red flag gun laws, pre-crime surveillance, fusion centers, threat assessments, mental health assessments, involuntary confinement to its arsenal of weaponized powers. The objective is not to make America safe again. That has never been the government's aim. Greenwald explains, why would such new terrorism laws be needed in a country that already imprisons more of its citizenry than any other country in the world as the result of a very aggressive set of criminal laws? What acts should be criminalized by new domestic terrorism laws that are not already deemed criminal? They never say, almost certainly because, just as was true of the first set of new war on terror laws, their real aim is to criminalize that which should not be criminalized: speech, association, protest, opposition to the new ruling coalition. So basically, folks, to sum it up, your First and Second Amendment rights. So you see, the issue is not whether Donald Trump or Roger Stone or MyPillow CEO Mike Lindell deserve to be banned from Twitter, even if they're believed to be spouting misinformation, hateful ideas, or fomenting discontent. Rather, we should be asking whether any corporation or government agency or entity representing a fusion of the two should have the power to muzzle, silence, censor, regulate, control, and altogether eradicate so-called dangerous or extremist ideas. This unilateral power to muzzle free speech represents a far greater danger than any so-called right or left-wing extremist might pose. The ramifications are so far-reaching as to render almost every American an extremist in word, deed, thought, or by association. Yet, where many go wrong is in assuming that you have to be doing something illegal or challenging the government's authority in order to be flagged as a suspicious character, labeled an enemy of the state, and locked up like a dangerous criminal. Eventually, all you will really need to do is use certain trigger words, surf the internet, communicate using a cell phone, drive a car, stay at a hotel, purchase materials at a hardware store, take flying or boating lessons, appear suspicious, question government authority, or generally live in the United States. The groundwork has already been laid. The trap is set. All that is needed is the right bait. With the help of automated eyes and ears, a growing arsenal of high-tech software, hardware, and techniques, government propaganda urging Americans to turn into spies and snitches, as well as social media and behavior sensing software, government agents have been busily spinning a sticky spiderweb of threat assessments, behavioral sensing warnings, flagged words, and suspicious activity reports aimed at snaring potential enemies of the state. It's the American police state's take on the dystopian terrors foreshadowed by George Orwell, Aldous Huxley, and Philip K. Dick, all rolled up into one oppressive pre-crime and pre-thought crime package. What's more, the technocrats who run the surveillance state don't even have to break a sweat while monitoring what you say, what you read, what you write, where you go, how much you spend, whom you support, and with whom you communicate. Computers, by way of AI, now do the tedious work of trolling social media, the internet, text messages, and phone calls for potentially anti-government remarks, all of which is carefully recorded, documented, and stored to be used against you someday at a time and place of the government's choosing. For instance, police in major American cities have been using predictive policing technology that allows them to identify individuals or groups of individuals most likely to commit a crime in a given community. Those individuals are then put on notice that their movements and activities will be closely monitored, and any criminal activity by them or their associates will result in harsh penalties. In other words, the burden of proof is reversed. You are guilty before you are given any chance to prove you are innocent. Where have we heard that before? None other than out of the mouth of a John Q. Brennan. Dig beneath the surface of this kind of surveillance/police state, however, and you will find that the real purpose of pre-crime is not safety, but control. Red flag gun laws merely push us that much closer towards a suspect society where everyone is potentially guilty of some crime or another and must be preemptively rendered harmless. This is the same government that has a growing list, shared with fusion centers and law enforcement agencies, of ideologies, behaviors, affiliations, and other characteristics that could flag someone as suspicious and result in their being labeled potential enemies of the state. For instance, if you believe in and exercise your rights under the Constitution, namely your right to speak freely, worship freely, associate with like-minded individuals who share your political views, criticize the government, own a weapon, demand a warrant before being questioned or searched, or any other activity viewed as potentially anti-government, racist, bigoted, anarchic, or sovereign, you could be at the top of the government's terrorism watch list. Moreover, as New York Times editorial warned, you may be an anti-government extremist, aka domestic terrorist, in the eyes of the police if you are afraid that the government is plotting to confiscate your firearms, if you believe the economy is about to collapse, and the government will soon declare martial law, or if you display an unusual number of political and or ideological bumper stickers on your car. That out of the New York Times, mind you. According to one FBI latest report, you might also be classified as a domestic terrorism threat if you espouse conspiracy theories, especially if you attempt to explain events or circumstances as the result of a group of actors working in secret to benefit themselves at the expense of others, and are usually at odds with official or prevailing explanations of events. Additionally, according to Michael C. McCarty, the FBI's Assistant Director of the Counterterrorism Division, the Bureau now, quote, classifies domestic terrorism threats into four main categories: racially motivated violent extremism, anti-government/anti-authority extremism, animal rights/environmental extremism, and abortion extremism. In other words, if you dare to describe to any views that are contrary to the government's, you may well be suspected of being a domestic terrorist and treated accordingly. Again, where many Americans go wrong is in naively assuming that you have to be doing something illegal or harmful in order to be flagged and targeted for some form of intervention or detention. In fact, U.S. police agencies have been working to identify and manage potential extremist quote-unquote threats, violent or otherwise, before they can become actual threats for some time now. In much the same way that the USA Patriot Act was used as a front to advance the surveillance state, allowing the government to establish a far-reaching domestic spying program that turned every American citizen into a criminal suspect, the government's anti-extremism program renders otherwise lawful, nonviolent activities as potentially extremist. In fact, all you need to do these days to end up on a government watch list or be subjected to heightened scrutiny is use certain trigger words like cloud, port, and pirates, surf the internet, communicate using a cell phone, limp or stutter, drive a car, stay at a hotel, attend a political rally, express yourself on social media, appear mentally ill, serve in the military, disagree with a law enforcement official, call in sick to work, purchase materials at a hardware store, take flying or boating lessons, appear suspicious, appear confused or nervous, fidget or whistle or smell bad, be seen in public waving a toy gun or anything remotely resembling a gun, such as a water nozzle or a remote control or a walking cane, stare at a police officer, question government authority, or appear to be pro-gun or pro-freedom. Be warned. Once you get on such a government watch list, whether it's a terrorist watch list, a mental health watch list, a dissident watch list, or a red flag gun watch list, there's no clear-cut way to get off, whether or not you should actually be on there. You will be tracked wherever you go. You will be flagged as a potential threat and dealt with accordingly. This is pre-crime on an ideological scale, and it's been a long time coming. The government has been building its pre-crime surveillance network in concert with fusion centers, of which there are 78 nationwide, with partners in the corporate sector and globally, data collection agencies, behavioral scientists, corporations, social media, and community organizers, and by relying on cutting-edge technology for surveillance, facial recognition, predictive policing, biometrics, and behavioral epigenetics, in which life experiences alter one's genetic makeup. If you're not scared yet, you should be. Connect the dots. Start with the powers amassed by the government under the USA Patriot Act. Note the government's ever-broadening definition of what it considers to be an extremist. Then add in the government's detention powers under NDAA, the National Security Agency's far-reaching surveillance networks, and fusion centers that collect and share surveillance data between local, state, and federal police agencies. To that, add tens of thousands of armed surveillance drones and balloons that are beginning to blanket American skies, facial recognition technology that will identify and track you wherever you go and whatever you do. And then, to complete the picture, toss in the real-time crime centers being deployed in cities across the country, which will be attempting to predict crimes and identify so-called criminals before they happen, based on widespread surveillance, complex mathematical algorithms, and prognostication programs. And by the way, to digress on that, doesn't matter if the algos are correct or otherwise. Doesn't matter. Hopefully, you're starting to understand how easy we've made it for the government to identify, label, target, defuse, and detain anyone it views as a potential threat for a variety of reasons that run the gamut from mental illness to having a military background to challenging its authority to just being on the government's list of persona non grata. There's always a price to pay for standing up to the powers that be. So, there you have it. Yep, good to see you, Zelda. What's going on? Claire Paseric, how we doing? Yeah, this is a fairly good article. Rutherford Institute, he's been harping on this police state for a very, very long time. And of course, as I said, the January 6th incident And as he lays out here, the legislation, I'm sure, was pre-written, ready to go, packaged by the K Street lobbyist corporations and that, who are at the ready to do business with the government and roll all this out in one fell swoop. And so we need to be cognizant of it. Do we need to be worried about being on a list? Well, I contend that if you're not on a list, you're probably not trying very hard, right? So you're probably in very good company. And of course, if you think back to our founding fathers, what were they considered? You think they'd be considered domestic terrorists of the day, going against the King of England? Probably. So again, we're probably in pretty good company. All right, well, to round things out on the evening, maybe a little bit more uplifting piece. This come out yesterday out of Breakpoint. It says, finding meaning in life is good for your health. So aside from all the doom and gloom porn spewed here in the last few articles, perhaps this one will be a little bit more uplifting. It says, in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl wrote, those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how. Both the book and its most famous quote were products of an incredibly difficult experience. During World War II, Frankl and his family were deported from their native Vienna to various concentration camps, including Auschwitz. He was the only member of his family to survive. Frankl knew just how unbearable the how of life could be. And yet, as Frankl explained, humans are meaning-seeking creatures. We want to believe that there's more to life than meeting our basic survival needs of food, water, shelter, and safety. Even more, we need this to be true. Otherwise, ours becomes a purely animal existence. Despite all the zoo placards and biology textbooks assuring us that humans are just animals, we certainly don't act like survival and promulgating these species are all that matters. Without meaning, hope is difficult, if not impossible. At best, without meaning, we resort to a kind of detachment and resignation. At worst, we resort to self-harm, violence, or even suicide. On the other hand, the benefits of meaning extend well beyond psychological and spiritual health. As a recent article in the Washington Post reports, a sense of purpose and meaning brings physical benefits as well. Believing that one's existence has meaning is linked to lower levels of the stress hormone cortisol and lower levels of heart inflammation. One study found that having a clear purpose in life can slow the impact of Alzheimer's in older patients. Another meta-analysis of various studies even suggested that having a purpose in life can lower risk of death equally, as well as following the Mediterranean diet. Of course, finding this kind of life-changing and life-extending purpose isn't as straightforward as changing a diet or starting a new exercise routine. An essential place to begin is the opening sentence of Rick Warren's The Purpose Drive Life. It's not about you. Purpose is not found by looking inward. It's found by looking outward, and it is manifested in what we do for others. Among the examples cited by the Post article were volunteering, donating to charity, and joining a group of people who share your values. What all of these ideas have in common is that they remove us, for however long, from the center of our personal universe. Of course, nothing turns our perspective outward and upward like faith in Jesus Christ. I don't mean the consumerist, therapeutic kind of inward-looking religion that too often passes for Christianity these days. I mean something along the lines of what Paul told the Corinthians. And Christ died for all, so that those who live might live no longer for themselves, but for him who died and was raised for them. 2 Corinthians 5:15. Living for the one who died and rose again not only removes us from the center of our own universe, but aligns our hearts and minds with what is actually true about the universe. That it belongs to God, and that our purpose is given by him, not determined by us. True faith locates our lives in this cultural moment within the larger story of God, and how He is fulfilling His purposes throughout each chapter of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. When we no longer see our lives and actions as isolated, we realize they are part of the story and even the means by which God is restoring all things. Knowing this doesn't make the how any easier. As my colleague Shane Morris recently testified on Breakpoint, Paul told the Corinthians that toil, hardship, sleepless nights, hunger, thirst, and anxiety were his lot as an apostle of Jesus Christ. But he also knew that his suffering wasn't meaningless. Neither, for that matter, was his success. Despite and even through him, God's purposes were being fulfilled. This is the ultimate why. This message is not only true, it's worth sharing, especially in a world where, for so many, meaning has been lost, and the best efforts to manufacture meaning fall short. So there you have it. Short little piece out of Breakpoint that came through yesterday. Hopefully you guys find purpose and meaning in what each of you guys do, as I try to do day in and day out. Do I worry about the ever-encroaching police state at the end of the day, whether or not I'm put on a list? Nope, not at all. We're called to be bold in what we do, right? Hopefully you're righteous in your cause. And that's what I try to strive to do each and every time that I do one of these deals. Put information out for you guys, broadcast, whatever. So hopefully that resonates with you a little bit here this evening. As I said, hopefully to end a little bit on a bit of a high note compared to the negative side of all the stuff that's being thrown at us. Just rest assured that at the end of the day, each and every one of us does have a purpose. Each and every one of us has very unique skill sets, and that can be used in this time. And unfortunately, our oppressors see otherwise. They see us only as batteries or feeders or sheep or farm animals, essentially, to their purposes. No, they couldn't be more wrong. So that's what I'll leave you with here this evening. Appreciate you guys tuning in, as always. Tomorrow night, I'll try and be back here again. I am going to go ahead and put a piece together talking about what has happened with Davos, the World Economic Forum. Got a number of articles already pulled for that, so stick around tomorrow night, probably around the same time, and we'll touch upon the goings-on there. So again, appreciate you guys tuning in. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe across all the platforms here if you're following. Be sure to follow on Gab as well, and we'll see you back next time. Take care. God bless, everybody.